On paper, the Caneiro family was a New Jersey success story. Two brothers built a thriving technology business, sharing the profits and prestige. But beneath the corporate paperwork, a financial rot was taking hold. The company was co-owned by 51-year-old Paul Caneiro and his 50-year-old brother Keith. They shared the executive load, while a third brother, Corey, forged a completely separate career. Despite equal ownership, the brothers lived in different worlds. Keith returned home to a sprawling mansion. Paul lived in a much more modest house in Ocean Township. That sharp economic gap fostered a quiet resentment. Over years, watching his younger brother enjoy a visible fortune set the stage for a total family collapse. To bridge his perceived wealth gap, Paul embezzled from shared assets, drained trust accounts, and funneled cash into his pockets. This worked until late 2018, when Keith audited the ledger and discovered the missing funds. We know exactly when the situation reached a breaking point. A recorded phone call captured Keith confronting Paul. He told Paul, "I need to know where that money went. I just spent half a day looking." That call took place roughly 24 hours before Keith was murdered. Exposure meant prison and total financial ruin for Paul. But Keith's death offered a different path, a $3 million life insurance policy that would solve Paul's financial problems. Paul faced a clear choice. He could admit his theft and lose everything, or eliminate Keith to bury the secret and collect the payout. He made his choice on November 20th, 2018. It was exactly 2 days before Thanksgiving. That morning, Paul drove 80 kilometers from his home in Ocean Township to his brother's estate in Colts Neck. He was driving his black Porsche Macan, a vehicle with distinct taillights that would later be spotted on surveillance footage. The attack began on the front lawn. Keith Caneiro was shot 5 times before he could even reach his front door. He fell face down in the grass. Inside the house, the targets changed. Paul shot and stabbed his sister-in-law, Jennifer, then turned a blade on his 11-year-old nephew, Jesse, and his 8-year-old niece, Sophia. Sophia alone was stabbed over 40 times, with wounds so violent they fractured her sinus cavity and penetrated her brain. Forensics later confirmed the children did not die immediately from the stabbing. Paul disabled the security system and set the mansion on fire, leaving Jesse and Sophia to perish from smoke inhalation. By the time Paul left the property, every member of Keith's immediate household was either dead or dying inside the burning structure. Paul then drove back to Ocean Township and intentionally set his own home on fire, using gasoline, while his wife and 2 daughters were inside. They managed to escape unharmed. The second fire was a piece of theater. Paul wanted investigators to see 2 burning Caneiro homes and conclude that an outside threat was hunting the entire family, but his attempt to look like a victim failed. Investigators tracked his Porsche on CCTV, and a canine unit detected the odor of human remains in the cargo area of his car. Arson materials found at his own home matched the debris at the Colts Neck mansion. Paul's effort to engineer a conspiracy only provided the physical evidence needed to name him as the sole killer. By the time the trial began in early 2026, Paul faced a mountain of physical evidence. With life in prison on the line, he attempted one final deflection. His defense team introduced a strategy designed to create reasonable doubt by pointing the finger at the only other Caneiro brother, Corey. Corey had no connection to the businesses, no financial motive, and no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. The accusation was a legal tactic with no evidentiary foundation. Corey Caneiro sat in the courtroom and watched as his surviving brother's legal team tried to frame him for the murder of his own family. The move showed the extent of Paul's pathology. To save himself, he willingly sacrificed the reputation of the last family member he had left. The jury deliberated for just 5 hours before finding Paul guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without parole, citing cold, deliberate malice. While the verdict provided a legal conclusion, it could not fill the void. 2 days before Thanksgiving, an entire branch of a family had been erased from existence. Corey Caneiro remains the final victim of this case, a man who lost his brother's family to an act of violence and his only surviving brother to a public, calculated betrayal.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're looking at a reality that's frankly almost too dark to even comprehend. We are going to be taking a strict, factual look at the Caneiro family murders, a case that just concluded with a sentencing 3 weeks ago on May 19, 2026. Now, what you're about to hear is incredibly graphic, but it is the documented truth of what happened to a family that was completely erased, and the extraordinary lengths a man went to in order to cover his tracks.
Our timeline begins just 2 days before Thanksgiving in 2018. A man gets into his car and he drives 80 kilometers from his home to his brother's house. And he didn't make this journey to celebrate the upcoming holiday. He made this drive to commit an act of unspeakable, calculated violence against his own flesh and blood. Inside that house were his brother, his sister-in-law, his 11-year-old nephew, and his 8-year-old niece, Sophia. Sophia, the absolute youngest victim, was stabbed more than 40 times. The prosecution laid out how she was stabbed through her nasal cavity with such violence that it actually penetrated her brain and through her chest, completely collapsing her lung.
But the truly horrific truth here? The stab wounds aren't what ultimately killed the children. 11-year-old Jesse and 8-year-old Sophia did not die immediately. The perpetrator disabled the home security system, set the house on fire, and left them alive inside. The children were left to die of smoke inhalation as the house literally burned around them.
After all of that, he gets back into his car and drives those same 80 kilometers right back home. He then uses gasoline to set his own house on fire, while his wife and 2 daughters are inside, unharmed. Investigators quickly realized the second fire was entirely staged. It was a calculated, cold move to make himself look like a victim of some targeted family attack, rather than the man who just completely annihilated his brother's family.
Just 3 weeks ago, the legal chapter of this nightmare concluded. Paul Caneiro, the man who committed these atrocities, was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge called him exactly what the evidence proved him to be, a manipulative, cold-blooded killer.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Who were the brothers? 2 lives, 1 motivation. So we're looking at 51-year-old Paul Caneiro and his 50-year-old brother Keith. They co-own technology businesses together over in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Now, they did have a third brother, Corey, but he had absolutely zero involvement in their businesses. But Paul and Keith, they lived very different lives. Keith lived with his wife Jennifer and their 2 kids in the sprawling mansion on Willowbrook Road in the highly affluent township of Colts Neck. Meanwhile, Paul lived in a much more modest home in Ocean Township. And you know, this massive financial disparity? That formed the very foundation of the prosecution's theory of motive.
Section 2. The motive. Missing money and a $3 million policy.
You see, prosecutors uncovered that Paul had been siphoning funds from their shared businesses for years, and he was running an insurance fraud scheme right alongside it. Well, Keith had started discovering irregularities in the company's finances. He was asking questions, and the day before the murders, Keith finally confronted Paul. In a recorded call played at trial, Keith's voice was demanding, "Paul, I need to know where that money went. I just spent a half a day looking for it." When you combine this looming exposure with a massive $3 million life insurance policy on Keith's life, a very clear, very deadly motive starts to emerge. When Keith made that phone call demanding answers, he had absolutely no idea it would be one of the last conversations of his life.
Section 3, November 20, 2018. The day of the murders.
This meticulous timeline clearly maps out Paul's movements the day the Caneiro family was erased. Surveillance footage captured his distinctively shaped Porsche Macan leaving his home in the morning and returning later. The timeline tracks his drive to Colts Neck, the murders and the fire, his drive back, and then the completely staged fire at his own home. The details of what actually happened during that window in Colts Neck are just brutal. Keith Caneiro was shot 5 times. He was found dead on his own front lawn, face down, with the hood of his sweatshirt pulled over his head and a bullet hole right through it. Inside the house, his wife Jennifer was shot and stabbed. Her body was burned so severely in the subsequent fire that the responding detective could literally see her muscle structure.
We really have to pause here and reiterate the specific, horrifying tragedy of the children. As we touched on earlier, 11-year-old Jesse and 8-year-old Sophia were brutally stabbed, but they perished from smoke inhalation. Paul deliberately disabled the home security system before setting the fire. That fire would ultimately end his niece and nephew's lives.
Section 4. The false accusation. Blaming the innocent.
Now, what's really interesting about this part of the story is how the defense added a profound layer of cruelty to the tragedy. First, let's look at the mounting evidence against Paul. He was initially only charged with arson for his own home, but the evidence for the murders piled up fast. There was the surveillance footage of his Porsche, the financial theft Keith had uncovered, the broken bottles, and a severed wire at the Colts Neck home that was consistent with arson. And critically, a canine unit detected the specific odor of human remains right in the cargo area of Paul's Porsche.
Faced with this absolute mountain of evidence, Paul's defense strategy was to point the finger elsewhere. But they didn't just point it at some random suspect. They baselessly accused a third brother, Paul Caneiro. Remember, Corey had zero connection to the businesses, no documented motive whatsoever, and had literally just endured the loss of his entire family. There was no evidentiary foundation for this. It was purely a tactic to try and manufacture reasonable doubt.
Prosecutor Nicole Wallace addressed this devastating tactic directly during the trial. She told the jury, Corey lost his brother that day, his sister-in-law, his niece, and his nephew. And to add insult to injury, the defendant accused Corey of being responsible for these atrocities. It forced an innocent, deeply grieving man to sit in a courtroom and be publicly accused of annihilating his own family.
Section 5. The verdict. 5 hours to justice.
When the trial finally concluded in early 2026, it did not take long at all for the jury to see right through the defense's strategy. After a 5-week trial, they deliberated for just 5 hours before finding Paul Caneiro guilty on all charges. He sat completely stone-faced. The sentencing then allowed the victim's family to finally speak. Jennifer's mother, Bette, pointed out the incredibly cruel coincidence that Jennifer and Keith now share the exact same date of death as well as the same birthday. Her sister, Bonnie Caritas, told the court an entire branch of a family was erased 2 days before Thanksgiving, leaving behind this permanent, agonizing void.
The absolute finality of the law was handed down by Judge Lemieux. The defense actually requested concurrent sentences, but the judge firmly denied it. Paul Caneiro received 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional sentence for aggravated arson. Monmouth County Prosecutor Raymond Santiago stated it perfectly outside the court. The crimes were pure evil. Which really brings us to the most lingering, painful thread of this whole explainer. We've looked at the facts, the timeline, the evidence, and the verdict. But I want to leave you with this final thought regarding the third brother. What is the lasting psychological toll on Corey Caneiro? He is a man who was forced to endure the horrific murder of his family, only to be falsely implicated in their deaths by the very brother who killed them. It's a dual tragedy that the legal system can never truly fix, leaving us to wonder how someone carries that kind of weight for the rest of their life.